We wanted to welcome everybody to the presentation of a selection of undergraduate thesis proposals from the Tulane School of Architecture. This entire thesis year was co-taught with my colleague Ammar Eloueini. We wanted to express our gratitude to all the people and entities that were involved in the successful completion of this thesis year, especially Dean Iñaki Alday and Associate Dean Kentaro Tsubaki, Naomi Englar and Kristen Jones, and especially Archinect for making this event possible. A thesis at the Tulane School of Architecture is established over the course of an entire year by first researching an architectural topic and developing a position on the topic, a thesis, and then exploring that topic through a program and a site. The research and process work is compiled in a document, and the project is then developed through research according to the principles and parameters articulated in the research document. Taken together, the outcome of these activities is considered an architectural thesis. The final products of the spring semester are design presentations, which consists of the architectural testing of the thesis, which was initiated through the research in the fall. Altogether, the thesis at the school, at the Tulane School of Architecture, has a series of requirements associated with it. It needs to be a researchable topic that can be articulated in text and explored through design. It should include aspects of the thesis topics that have been explored by others, other architects and critics. Several viable positions or points of view surrounding the topic are part of the current dialogue of architecture, and those should be explored. It should have more than one credible response, enabling the thesis and the written work combined with the thesis, an overall argument to operate with productive and creative friction. It should be discussable and disputable. It should be a carefully researched and clearly articulated approach to architectural design, and it should aspire to contribute to the development of architecture as a whole as it enters new ground and instigates new discussions. Ammar, you want to follow up?
Yes, I would like to join you in congratulating everyone who is with us today and all the other students who are not with us today, but made it successfully through the semester. Cordula and I have been working with students on thesis for many years. And this year we decided to join efforts and work with a larger cohort together. That was a great experience, and it was very successful. So it was a real pleasure doing that. Obviously, we had to transition with the COVID-19 to online teaching. So kudos to all you for making the extra effort and successfully completing the projects that we will be looking at today. So I'm going to turn it back to Cordula, and we can start looking at the work.
Yeah, this has been a really fruitful collaboration, and the transition from in-person to online has been fairly seamless, thanks to many involved in making the transition possible. And thanks also to the students for their courage, determination, and taking charge and facing the newly added responsibilities. We thought everybody did a great job. The proposals that we're looking at today, that are presented today, are by Kate Katz and Ryan Shaaban, who collaborated as a team. Anna Chu and Isabella Zannier, who also collaborated, Yara, Hantash, and Jacob Smiley. So thank you, students. It's great to see all of you again in this format. And we're going to start with Kate and Ryan as a first proposal.
Hello. I'm going to share my screen. So can everyone see my screen? Fine. All right. This thesis looks at the future of coastal cities in relationship to global sea level rise, and will use San Francisco as an urban prototype.
Recently observed sea level rise is attributed to factors such as glacial melt and oceanic thermal expansion caused by human greenhouse gas emissions. The most recent predictions for sea level rise have doubled in the last decade and are expected to exponentially increase with continued warming, proving that estimations of sea level rise have been severely underestimated and do not account for the unpredictability of the climate system. Sea level rise has become a major concern for coastal cities due to the economic importance tied to their geolocation, along with the high population density found within urban limits. These cities have sustained their livelihood in low-lying elevations through the process of filling, bridging, and raising land over coastal ecosystems, replacing their ecological value with infrastructures focused on defining the edge between city and nature. Hard infrastructures have minimal capacity for both human and non-human engagement due to their monofunctional applications focused on separating conditions rather than integrating them. As these systems are employed for the protection of conventional landscapes, they produce short-term gains with long-term consequences, replacing and restricting ecosystems and acting as a physical barrier in a context based on transition.
So in order to address the issues of hard infrastructure and sea level rise, this thesis in a poetic sense strives to change the perception of how we as humans relate to nature by accommodating the dynamic qualities of water into the urban grid. San Francisco is a great location of study. It's a peninsular condition in which the majority of predicted inundation occurs on the bay side. In this estuary, there were once over 500 acres of ecologically rich tidal marshlands, but they were filled in the late 1800s. To protect those lands, the Embarcadero seawall was built in 1916, and to this day is their only form of infrastructure and in need of repair. It protects over $100 billion worth of assets, including vital transportation networks, such as the BART and Muni Rail. The city has set aside $5 billion to repair the system, but here as designers of the future, we must intervene and say, instead of pouring money into a broken system, we need to invest in adaptive strategies that renew the balance between urbanity and nature. San Franciscans have a great attitude of resiliency. There's in fact a waterfront resiliency program whose projects, shown here, hope to satisfy the public desire to be more connected conceptually to their maritime past as well as physically to their waterfront. The administrative office even recognizes the crumbling infrastructure need adaptive solutions and have monetary incentives in place for proposals. The two creeks shown here, Mission and Isaias Creek, are the starting points of inundation. Isaias Creek is located in an industrial and sparse neighborhood, whereas Mission Creek lies below the Soma district, which is a mixed-use and dense neighborhood. We will use the site of Soma to represent typical urban conditions at risk in San Francisco.
To accommodate the risk of sea level rise, the city will inundate with water, creating the opportunity for a new circulation system to take place that maintains accessibility throughout areas located in the flood zone. From 2020 to 2040, a canal system will be carved into the streets, allowing for ferries to circulate as water reaches 1.8 feet above present-day levels. During this time, buildings will also begin retrofitting floors that are at risk of flooding, along with the development of adaptive reuse of publicly owned coastal properties into production facilities for the new network of ferries and walkways. From 2040 to 2060, the walkway begins to be installed as sea level reaches 3.9 feet and inundates the lowest areas adjacent to Mission and Isaias Creek. The system of walkways will continue to expand until 2100 as sea level reaches 10.2 feet and continues into the next century.
On the lower level of this system, floating walkways take place of traditional sidewalk, where pedestrians board boats at the corners. In order to cross, pedestrians go along ramps that rise up to 25 feet to allow for ferries to pass below. The upper level is dedicated to alternative means of transportation. Since we're in an innovative city, such as San Francisco, we can expect technologies such as compact electric cars or various personal transport vehicles to be commonplace. Together, these elements create a circulation network, where instance moments, such as the way a path connects to a particular building, become moments of pause and relief to enjoy the new cityscape in the area. On the lower level, the paths widen to become plazas, while on the upper level, they become breakout destinations, which can connect to certain occupiable rooftops that are given back to the public realm. Since San Francisco is culturally a walking city, this system emphasizes the pedestrian network.
All of these moments composed together create a distinct waterfront district that allows San Franciscans to engage with coastal ecosystems while building systemic support of maritime activity.
This perspective shows the makeup of the floating walkways and how, in either addition or subtraction of the modular walkway surface, one can create street furniture elements or apertures to engage with the ecology below. This upper walkway perspective shows how the ramps slope to connect to the buildings, where there is a second raised lobby floor, and the building accepts the walkway in the language of a carve. Finally, a boat perspective. These boats become the main form of public transportation, taking place of city buses along major streets, while smaller personal boats can be used on secondary streets.
So by taking a cut through the street, the stratification becomes apparent along with the methods of adaptation that existing structures will undertake to accommodate inundation and the new modes of movement throughout the city. In the bottom, the preceding canal system that allowed ferries to transport people from 2020 to 2040 acts as a seeding ground for plants and aquatic life as water level rises over time. Buildings can protect high-risk floors through floodproofing and encasement as demonstrated in the right side of the drawing. The floating walkway is composed of modular units that are buoyant, allowing the pedestrian levels to adapt and fluctuate with diurnal tidal changes. This system enables a once restricted landscape of wetlands to take place within the city, connecting pedestrians to their environmental context.
This new vision of the public realm in this waterfront district hopes to shine an optimistic light on how we can live with nature once again as we deal with the consequences of climate change. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, Kate and Ryan. We're going to segue to the next presentation, Anna and Isa.
Okay. Hello, everybody. I am Isa.
And I am Anna, and our thesis is titled Architecture of Liberation, where we are developing a system of spatial conditions for protection, transition, and growth.
Shelters for women first appeared in the 1970s in rooms rented by volunteers or apartments rented by individuals. And the next decade, they were institutionalized and they experienced their professionalization. And even though up until today, the number of shelters has grown significantly, the majority of shelters still exist in housing infrastructures that have been slightly modified to accommodate a higher number of women and children. Our thesis focuses on the typology of shelter for women and children survivors of domestic abuse, and we propose a new model of women's shelter that investigates the architecture of boundaries as a spatial organizer and a regulator between public and private areas. Additionally, we're considering the stages of healing that women and children go through after escaping an abusive situation and their transition to community. So in this diagram, you can see that nowadays shelters mostly address the stages 1 and 2 that require housing components. And we're proposing a new typology that opens the floor to community connection, or stage 3. Doing that by adding a public component to the program of a shelter, which would require then for the project to have circulation that addresses users that are public and private.
Okay, so this is a diagram that shows our new typology, where we have represented the boundary as a continuous element that it serves as a spatial organizer of the programmatic volumes, and at the same time, it sets the level of privacy of these volumes. The diagrams below, the first set of diagrams, are just an exploration of how this diagram this boundary changes in form and thickness. The second set is how this diagram would adapt to site conditions such as linear lots, corner lots, and infill lots. And then the third set of diagrams are explorations of how this diagram would behave in a loop condition, creating a courtyard scheme. The diagrams above are a diagram of an analysis of the boundary as a thickened condition. These diagrams are based on 3 criteria, which are sense of security, sense of privacy, and connectivity. The diagrams below are depictions of spatial moments where there's a direct connection to nature with the built environment. The site we chose to test our thesis is in an existing site of an existing shelter in Panama City. The existing shelter is called Maria Guadalupe Shelter. The site is surrounded by mostly residential and industrial buildings. As you can see in the picture below, that's the front facade of the existing shelter, and it is right now surrounded by a non-architectural element of a see-through fence. Here you can see a comparison between the existing layout of the shelter and the proposal of our project. As you can see, the difference between these two comparisons is that in our proposal, we are moving away from the idea of a single building and introducing the network of different buildings. Here, this is a bird's eye view of the entire project. And as you can see, the project is divided in 3 main volumes, where number 1 is the family center, number 2 is the entrance to the shelter, and number 3 is the housing component of the shelter. And here you can also see in the continuous element of the boundary, the specific locations where this boundary has variations.
So these are the 6 different boundary conditions that exist in the project. First, we have a threshold condition of the boundary. Then wall type B, it's the boundary opening up to create an extra layer of privacy, which would be semi-private. Then wall type C is the boundary holding planters for gardening activity. Wall type D shows the boundary completely surrounding a volume to create a extremely private moment, which is the nursery in the shelter. Wall type E has the boundary accommodate an extra layer of privacy with vegetation. And then wall type F is the boundary holding vertical circulation or stairs. And on the ground floor, you can see this boundary element continues throughout the entire site. It starts with the threshold condition in the entrance of the shelter. Then this is the semi-private corridor that the boundary creates. In the family volume, it holds a service space and vertical circulation. And then in the family center, pierce through the volume to completely separate areas of that building to be completely private from the public space of the family center. And then on the upper levels is where the library of the family center takes place, offices for workers, and bedrooms for the women and children of the shelter. In section A, we're cutting through the family center and we're showing the boundary as a hallway and divider. Then the main central open space of the project, and then the semi-private corridor, which is also wall type B. And in the middle ground, you can see the facade of the housing component. And then below section B, we are cutting through the nursery space, surrounded on both sides by the boundary, and with the bedrooms above that are hovering over the boundary. And then we're cutting through the family center as well, showing a boundary as a vertical circulation. And in the middle ground, you can see wall type D, which is the boundary, and the vegetation layer. And then in this section perspective, we're cutting through the private garden in the back of the housing component of the shelter, the common space on the ground floor of the housing, and shared balconies at the back, and then in the front of the building, a double facade system that allows for more private set of balconies.
Then in this vignette, you can see how the boundary creates this semi-private corridor leading towards the entrance of the shelter. And then in here, you can see the private courtyard in the back part of the housing component. And then here, you can see how the boundary creates that space of the nursery and the relationship this nursery has with the central garden of the project. And in here, you can see how this boundary goes inside the building and inside the family center and creates the main stair of the building. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Yara, are you ready?
Okay, thank you everyone for joining us today. The title of my thesis project is Involuntary Utopia, Excavating Peace in Subterranean Jerusalem. In the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, the act of architecture is an act of violence, and it's an act of occupation, and it's the architecture of frontiers. I posit that in the near future, herbicide, which is defined as violence against the city, and spatiocide, rather than genocide, which is the targeting of land as defined by architects A.L. Weitzman and Said Hanafi, will destroy the urban fabric of Jerusalem. The following proposal is a speculative exploration, proposing the subterranean realm as the new frontier, where the act of architecture will unite these parties rather than divide them. Already, the underground is becoming the site of many activities, such as the smuggling of goods and people across borders and warfare and espionage. Tunnels appear at the seam of the highest conflict zones, such as Gaza and the Golan Heights. In Jerusalem, underground spaces have a different connotation. These are sites of preserved history and narrative making. As the city above falls victim to this herbicide and spatiocide, and her people become accustomed to life underground, they are driven below the city's surface. In a realm untouched by their conflict, they shape the space to accommodate not the future they want, but the future that they need. A series of spaces along the north-south axis, parallel to the Temple Mount, starting from the cave, host the daily life of the exiled Jerusalemites. Spaces along the east-west axis, perpendicular to the Temple Mount, start from the foundation stone, host the spiritual life of the exiles. As the exiles become more united, their spaces cut deeper into the earth, and at first they rely on light from the outside. Below the surface, they learn how to provide light for themselves, and underground architecture isn't a matter of placing walls and ceilings to create space, but carving the desired spaces out of light. It is a subtractive endeavor. Access to light becomes fundamental to the life underground, and light is the currency, divinity, and basis of society there. The descent begins to the north. Carved into the city wall, there's the mouth of the cave. Quarried over centuries.
Yara, your screen is not moving, so you want to make sure. No. Sorry for interrupting.
Oh no, sorry that it's not working.
All right. So can you take a few slides back and start again?
Yeah, here?
Okay. It wasn't moving from the first slide, so you might want to go just backtrace a couple.
Okay, so is it moving now? Okay, and so here
could you also make it full screen, please?
Yeah, it shows full screen on my computer. Okay, now? Okay.
It's still not full screen, but I think it's okay.
Okay. So this map shows the tunnels dug below that suture the conflict zones in the Gaza Strip shown below and the Golan Heights shown above. And then this is a map of the underground spaces in Jerusalem that are already being occupied and visited by tourists today. And here's a map, an aerial view showing the proposed spaces. These are the north-south spaces where daily life occurs, and these are the east-west spaces where the spiritual and society acts of community occur. And so the descent begins to the north.
Still not moving, Yara.
Still not moving?
You might have to.
I guess this is the only way I can do it.
Okay.
Where it's moving.
Okay. That works.
Yeah, sorry about that. And so the descent begins to the north, where carved into the city wall, the mouth of the cave allows in the exiles. It has been quarried over centuries to build the city above, and the cave is now a haven for the exiled Jerusalemites. A channel is dug into the earth, widening the entry for the influx of the exiles fleeing the wreckage they have wrought above. The cave is where they gather. The banished masses divided along common lines. As resources dwindle and survival becomes elusive rather than certain, it becomes clear that the old divisions of above do not apply below. The former urbanites remember the fellahin who harvested olives and herded sheep, and the kibbutzniks who yielded masses of crops that were exported across the globe. Together they make the cave a fertile land from which they subsist. Ma'arnamin Binat, traditional master builders, and Adrichalim, trained architects, carve holes in the ceiling of the cave, flooding their fields with light. As the needs of the exiles expanded, the builders continued to quarry the cave, making more room for cultivation and using the stone to build other spaces. From the cave emerged the field, a monument to resilience. Palestinian sumud, or steadfastness, and pastoral memory are essential to the sustenance of the field. Here, livestock are kept and tended, and the animals are ready to descend into the market for slaughter. Where the historic quarters that divided the city above met, a tower soars high into the sky, a beacon for those miles away of the tenacious life flourishing beneath the bones of Old Jerusalem. On the observation deck, the tower is monitored and controlled in the observatory. Where the field is a testament to resilience, the observatory is a monument to persistence. Here, decades of Israeli advancements in technology provide the settlement with energy and water. The operations of the settlement are monitored, a new calendar is devised, and the abandoned city above is remembered by the observatory. Above the observatory sits the forum. Open to the world above, the exiles gather beneath the meager sunlight to exchange goods and ideas, to escape the toil of the cave and the depths of the observatory, and to seek the wisdom of the elders. Old myths and new emerge to create a shared memory of a destroyed past and an uncertain future. Children play together in the streets, and as the children grow, a new language grows with them, a hybrid of Arabic and Hebrew that learns common roots and forgets the divisive words from above. On the tower, banners are hung depicting symbols of the new world that the exiles have excavated. South of the market, deep wells are cut into the earth, and radiating from them are the dwellings. As their excavation was slow, the exiles did not have the opportunity to segregate themselves as they had above. The public spaces of the dwellings face the interior of the wells, and in turn, the private acts of daily life are revealed to each other. Shared intimacies not possible above show the exiles how much they've shared for generations, yet never dared to acknowledge. As the exiles grow in unity and their excavated futures become more certain, they find the desire to perform their new culture. West of the forum, deep beneath the surface, the theater is excavated. Grand, it can host all of the exiles. They dance the debke and the hora together at the same time. They sing of hewn stone and dark fields. They recite lines about abandoned cities and divine light. Deep underground, after years of occupying the new frontier, they no longer need light from above and illuminate the theater by their own means. Here, shared culture of the involuntary utopia manifests. Beneath the foundation stone, a sacred piece of earth housed by numerous temples and shrines for millennia, a deep but narrow well is dug. A single shaft of sunlight beams into the space once a day at noon. The temple is a shrine to light, the exile's most coveted remnant from above. As years pass, the exile's skin turns gray, their vision dims, and the rituals of above are forgotten. Light becomes sacred. It is the exile's link to divinity, and in this sacred space, true unity is found. And that is it.
Thank you, Yara.
Okay, great. Thank you. And last but not least, we have Jacob.
Hello, thank you all for coming. Can you see that?
Yes, but can you make it full screen?
Yeah, it should be now.
Okay, great.
Yeah. Hello, my name is Jacob Smiley, and this thesis proposes the conservation of old-growth redwood forests through architectural intervention. So before moving into the project, I'd like to go over a few key terms. Carbon sequestration, which is of course the process of pulling carbon dioxide out of the atmosphere and holding it in solid and liquid form. Epiphyte, which is a plant that grows on another in a non-parasitic manner, very prevalent in redwood forests. Mycorrhiza, which is the symbiotic association between fungus and a plant, referring to the fungus's role in the plant's root system. Old growth forest, a forest that has attained great age without significant ecological disturbance, whether that be natural or man-made. Rhizosphere, which is the region of soil and vicinity of plant roots in which the biology is influenced by their growth, respiration, and nutrient exchange. Sequoia sempervirens, otherwise known as the coastal redwood, which is a long-lived evergreen monoecious tree living 1,200 to 1,800 years or more, and is the focus of this thesis. And lastly, symbiosis, the interaction between two different organisms living in close physical association to the advantage of both species. So of the 2 million acres of old-growth redwood forest present in Northern California in 1840, only 100,000 remain today, which is just 5% of the original total. Rapid and extensive deforestation and expansion of agriculture and real estate in the area is largely what is attributed to this. While what old-growth forest remains is mostly protected under state and federal legislature, nothing is being done to safeguard this ecosystem from the threats of climate change. Hotter and drier summers threaten the hydrological balance of an ecosystem where up to 60% of the water comes from fog rolling off the Pacific, a phenomenon threatened by rising temperatures. I'd like to begin by first providing a biological profile of the coastal redwood. It is the tallest tree on Earth, reaching heights of over 350 feet and 35 feet in diameter. Their natural habitat consists of a 400-mile stretch of land that hugs the Pacific coastline, extending from Big Sur in the south, all the way up to the extreme southwestern border of Oregon in the north. Another important characteristic to note is the redwood's longevity. While with the oldest redwoods reaching over 2,000 years of age, this longevity is a crucial aspect in relation to the forest's efficiency at carbon sequestration. This graph visualizes the average amount of carbon sequestered in 4 different forest biomes. Boreal forests on average sequester about 28.5 tons of carbon per acre. Tropical rainforests such as the Amazon sequester nearly 3 times that with about 71. While there is a significant amount of biomass in these forests, the rate of decay is also very high, which brings these numbers down. Redwood forests, on the other hand, with their enormous size of the trees and the natural stasis of the ecosystem, are significantly better suited for carbon sequestration. Second growth forests, those that have been logged in the last 200 years or so, house nearly twice the carbon sequestered by a tropical forest. Old growth forests, however, sequester more than 10 times that of a tropical carbon or a tropical rainforest. This is something important to consider as we live in an increasingly emissive society. In addition to the importance in regards to carbon sequestration, the redwood tree is a keystone species within its own ecosystem, with hundreds of other flora and fauna dependent on its presence for their survival. Many of the species are endangered and only found within the redwood forest. Some examples I've demonstrated here are the tan oak, which doesn't do well in direct sunlight, so it uses the redwood to shelter itself from direct rays. Redwoods themselves, due to their long size and longevity, can be colonized by numerous epiphytic plant species in a relationship that does no harm to the trees. Numerous birds nest within the canopy. The 2 I've chosen to focus on are the marbled murrelet and the northern spotted owl, both of which are endangered and both of which are only found within the redwood forest. Lastly, the dense upper canopy of the redwood traps a lot of fallen plant debris within it, causing it to decompose into soil within the branches, being supported by the branches. This canopy soil has been known to house spruce and fir trees over 100 feet in the air, essentially creating a floating microbiome within the forest. The importance of the redwood to this unique ecosystem cannot be understated, and it demonstrates yet another reason why its conservation is so important. So while the case for conservation is clear, the implementation of these strategies is not. Legislative protection of the forest is great, but for meaningful conservation efforts to take place, one must look to physically address climate change, which of course, taken in its totality, is well beyond the scope of an architectural thesis. Therefore, this thesis proposes the implementation of architectural interventions within the ecosystem of the redwood rainforest that actively address the effects of climate change at the scale of the biome to restore, strengthen, and conserve the redwood rainforest. When selecting a site to use as a case study for this, I considered the presence of old growth forests as well as proximity to urbanized contexts. In addition to the ecological roles of this thesis, creating better opportunities for people to interface with the environment was very important to me. This led to the selection of the Muir Woods National Monument as the ideal site to implement the strategies found in this thesis. Located 10 miles north of the Golden Gate Bridge, the monument is the most frequently visited redwood reserve in the world with over 1 million annual visitors. In addition to its popularity, the steep canyon proved very difficult to log in the early 20th century, leaving over 40 acres of undisturbed old growth forest within the monument. Moving on to the architecture itself, the project consists of 3 different components: a series of fog towers distributed along the western ridge of the canyon, bio towers scattered throughout the canyon floor, and a redesigned visitor center meant to amplify the visitor's experience. The fog tower is skinned with a fog harp, which wicks moisture out of the air, much like the leaves of a redwood tree. The siting of a series of these towers along the western ridge of the canyon allowed them to be hit by a lot of the wet coastal air. This water would be stored in cisterns located at the foot of the tower and redistributed throughout the forest via water vaporizers found on top, where the prevailing winds coming off the Pacific would push the manufactured fog into the canyon. The biotower has been designed to mimic and supplement the ecological niche of the redwood, as well as allowing visitors to interact with the tower, moving vertically from the forest floor all the way up through the canopy. The biotower is scanned with a trellis to be colonized by epiphytic species native to the redwood forest, in addition to housing niches that can be settled by endangered bird species that could only be found within the monument. Those are listed here. So for instance, the marbled murrelet, which is a semi-colonial bird that inhabits branches. The facade would have branches sticking out, and then the northern spotted owl, which inhabits primarily notches within the trees, would have this sort of notched facade through which the species could inhabit. Both formally and structurally, the biotowers and fog towers are identical. The form is derived from stacking of 20-foot redwood structural modules that taper slightly to increase structural stability. These are then twisted to minimize wind loads and optimize surface area in differentiating views. 70% of the way up the tower, it begins to twist back the other way to partially shade areas used as shelter for endangered species. Structurally, designing a 200-foot tower made out of wood in the middle of Northern California, which is incredibly seismically active, poses a lot of challenges. I did a lot of research into the Japanese vernacular, particularly the architecture of the pagoda, to deal with seismic intensity. By utilizing these numerous strategies to counteract seismic forces, the project uses its material as something to be proud of, rather than something you must hide with its weakness that hinders it. Relative to one another, the fog towers occupy the western ridge located on the left of the site section, while the biotowers are spaced throughout the denser forest floor, both of which supplement and strengthen the ecosystem of the redwood forest. The third component of this thesis consists of a redesigned visitor center. The existing conditions not only struggle to handle the large influx of visitors, but fail to optimize educational aspects of the forest as well. In addition to an educational area, the building will house the typical park and restroom, and gift shop, in addition to space dedicated to forestry research, to be loaned out to universities who focus on the redwood ecosystem, as well as a series of creative lodges to be leased to artists and writers wishing to work in and capture the natural beauty of the forest. The visitor center will also house one of the towers found scattered throughout the forest. What differentiates this one from the others is the fact that its central shaft is replaced with an elevator core, making the upper canopy of the redwoods accessible to all. That's pretty much it. I like to end with this quote by conservationist Laura Leon White, who facilitated the exchange of the land that ultimately became the Muir Woods National Monument. Idiots, criminals, and the insane come and go regularly every few years, but the big trees, if they go, may never be reproduced on Earth. That's it. Thank you.
Thank you, Jacob.
Thank you, Jacob. We now have room for questions, Q&A from the audience. They can be posted through the Q&A button at the bottom. And so if anybody has any questions for the participants in regards to their projects, please let us know. And we just internally had a few questions for the students that we were interested in as we're wrapping up this thesis year and the projects. We were wondering what the most rewarding aspect of working on your thesis project was for you. And this is for all of you.
I guess I can start. I think really the interdisciplinary approach that I was able to take part in, especially like the first semester, I worked strictly with one of the environmental science professors and wrote a separate paper talking about the environmental context of San Francisco, understanding how it works in terms of the watershed, and also kind of how the bay operates. And that helped inform our thesis in terms of indicating what type of species we wanted to focus on, specifically the tidal marsh. And then the second semester, really, I was able then to work in kind of the fabrication of thinking of how like our modules and like how different species could interact in terms of like a surface application. So I think that was really rewarding in terms of the semester, being able to branch out and use the resources that I built upon throughout the years to create something that really kind of I would never have expected that I would have created, or that Kate and I would have created, you know, at the beginning.
Yeah, I'd also like to add, like, in working with Ryan, one of the things that I found really enjoyable in the process overall is that the thesis is not a linear process. We've explored a lot of different ideas and had really interesting discussions, which brought us into different like interdisciplinary realms. We looked at literature, we looked at religions and cultures to like analyze social behaviors in terms of being sustainable. And so I think that's one of the projects that I found most enjoyable, was kind of being able to explore different ways in which we could apply our lens.
Okay.
I think,
Anna, Isabella.
yeah, I think for us, it was that we were able to fully develop the thesis logic behind our project, and then at the same time, being able to choose a topic that we believe demands for interest from the design community. So that's what we feel was the most rewarding part of it.
Mm-hmm. How about Yara?
I think the most rewarding thing for me was that I went into, once I knew I was going to be doing a thesis, I knew that it would be regarding this topic. I think it was really rewarding for me to see how my personal beliefs and my understanding of this conflict and this topic evolved, and how that reflected in the project. I don't think, I had seen this being the outcome of my project, but like Kate and Ryan were saying, it's just not linear, and going back and forth and around and up and down. This is what I came out with, and I'm really proud of it and happy with what it resulted in my understanding of this topic and my beliefs, and how the project in architecture gave me the voice to share those beliefs. And that was really awesome.
Yeah, sort of in the same boat. What was the most rewarding part for me was the ability to work on something that could become so personal and so intimate with the person that was working on the project. So unlike anything you'd find in the professional world or through every other studio, it's truly your own project, it's your own prompt, it's your own design. It's not restrained by any curriculum or client, and it's really the one opportunity you get to express your design skills in its truest, most freest context. And for me, that was my favorite part.
It can also be pretty challenging, right? If you're the author of everything, you really have to set yourself pretty strict, parameters and, definitions in order to be able to develop some answers.
Gotta like what you're doing.
That is true too.
This is why we were there. I
Exactly.
hope we were helpful in acting as a sounding board or giving you. The thing with thesis is that you want every student or team to develop their own project, and you do not want to push the project in any direction, but you want to be there as a sounding board, something where you can bounce ideas off of us and be able to reflect on any feedback you get and push forward your own resolution of the project. So hopefully that was the case over the semester. I think we have a question from the audience for Kate and Ryan. And it is about how would you go about waterproofing the levels of the existing buildings that would be underwater in the future?
I think we touched on that issue several times in the process of developing this project.
Yeah, I can talk about that. So we developed a couple methods in terms of waterproofing, or how you would deal with flooding of buildings. So one of them that we showed in that section perspective was encasement. So that would be building a separate foundation on the outside and then encasing the building in a waterproofed structure. Another type of foundational change that we looked at was encasing the actual structure so that you could create an operable floor below that would then raise and lower with the tides. And then branching off within that design was that floor could then stop at a certain level then to create a sub-basement, or it could flow all the way up, or then you'd have to kind of carve out the building to allow that floor plate then to raise all the way up with the water level that would be expected by 2100.
some other things that we were thinking about in terms of like what are we waterproofing and what are we allowing to become a new use once it's inundated. So we were looking at the different types of materials we could use, such as eco-concrete that's porous, so that over time, once it's inundated, organisms could grow with it. And so that was another way in which we kind of like had an attitude of whether or not what we protect and then what we allow to give away.
Okay. There is another question from the audience in regards to hearing from any of you how your thesis work has impacted your plans or changed your direction as you enter the architectural profession. So what have you learned in the process that you maybe didn't know before or weren't aware of before that you now take into consideration as you're moving into the professional world?
I think for me, maybe the like hardcore schematics of the thesis may have to take a back burner, but sort of the research strategies and everything I've learned through this process is something that I'll be taking with me going forward. Just really the idea of researching your site and your context so heavily. I've been saying to everybody that my thesis is really only like 30% architecture. Even in my presentation, you don't see anything like real design until you're about halfway through. So I feel like I took away from this whole process that so much time should be paid to the site itself, and you really need to have a knowledge of what you're doing before you go in and do these things. So I think it's shaped my design philosophy moving forward a lot more than any other studio really that we've had.
Following up on that, you know, I don't think none of you is from New Orleans, correct? Or close by, but close. And you have been here for what now, 5 years? And I was wondering if you can talk a little bit about how, which is, you know, 5 years, considering your very young age, is a good part of your life now, and an important one. So how do you, you know, it's maybe it's a little bit too early, but can you reflect a little bit on how living in a city like New Orleans and attending Tulane School of Architecture affected your thinking about architecture? Do you feel that it had an impact on you that is, you know, that made you who you are now as an architect?
Yeah, we talked about how in Tulane School of Architecture, in our experience, there's a strong emphasis on public interest design, and New Orleans is a beautiful city that has a super strong sense of community, and I think that's what kind of like drove us towards a project that is very community involved and center. And actually, I think for both of us is that kind of a branch of architecture is where we want to continue to move forward.
I think in terms of like Kate and I, like our thesis, that dealt a lot with water, and New Orleans is one of the cities where there's a constant negotiation of space with water. And like my personal background, you know, I had the opportunity to work on small community infrastructure, dealing in the public interest design realm, but also through studio being able to work on more like a civic landscape and dealing with water and how like that can be thought of as an amenity. I think that's had a huge influence coming from Chicago. You know, we're above sea level, we deal with the lake, but New Orleans is a whole different type of context, and that really kind of has influenced just like my whole idea of how we think of these gradient zones and cities that were built in places that kind of can't really stand the test of time, and how we really adapt with that in such a climate change focused world.
That's interesting because, you know, you're talking about Chicago. Chicago and New Orleans are two cities where architecture is very important. You can talk to almost anybody that you meet on the street. If you're in an Uber or a cab, whatever, you know, everybody, people are very proud about their architecture and their environment, and very knowledgeable in general about that environment and about architecture. So it's interesting to see that, but also the distinctions that you're making in relationship to resiliency and relationship to water. Both they have a relationship to water, but it is a very different one.
Yeah, exactly, and also how that infrastructure responds. Like Chicago originally was a city that was built in a marsh. We just raised it up during the time, and New Orleans is kind of in that whole different context where they just built walls. So you know, we had different ways of dealing with it, and we did explore those in our thesis, dealing with the idea of bridging, raising, like how cities have really dealt with that kind of transforming their landscapes.
Yeah, I think to both of those points, so the first being that New Orleanians are so responsive like to their architecture, and I think that's something I really learned from the city, was how our attitudes and our beliefs shape our built environment. And I think Tulane gave me the tools to translate that into this project. And throughout the past 5 years, that's something that's been so important, is how we as people inhabit our space and how our spaces reflect our beliefs. And also, and this kind of answers a question that came up in the Q&A, when you're living in New Orleans, everybody says, oh, well, you know, it probably won't be here in 2 years. When we do our Tulane class reunion, it might be underwater, so we'll do it somewhere else. That feeling of like impending ending kind of was something I was familiar with, I guess. And so in my project, my goal was to show that, unfortunately, if we can't live in peace, or if we can't take care of our environment above, we may be forced below. So it's not that the underground is the perfect solution or like the perfect place to live. It's just that if we don't start taking care of ourselves, of our environment and each other, we might have to end up going underground. So that was
I agree with Yara on those points for sure. We're just living in New Orleans, the city's so good at blending the ideas of natural preservation with the built environment. We're living and we're learning in this environment and this community where it's also important to the well-being of not only the people, but the city as well, because it is so dependent on the world around it, the river, the lake, the swamp, the ocean, all of the water. So being surrounded by experts here at Tulane that recognize this really had a profound impact on my approach to preservation through design within my thesis.
Another interesting question that has come up is how the current scenario that we all be living with for the last 2 or 3 months influences, your decision making now. Are there aspects to your thesis that would be have to be reconsidered, or how do you take this information that we're now gathering forward with you, and in terms of developing responses to it? Would anything have changed about how you approach your thesis, knowing what we're knowing now?
For mine, at least, I would say the pandemic hasn't really changed my attitude towards my topic. My thesis aimed to put nature above people, and this is our problem, not really the redwood trees. So the way humans would typically interact with my project wouldn't have to drastically be altered. Hiking is usually conducive of safe social distancing practices. So since it's so non-humanistic, I would say, I wish I could have done a project that sort of mimicked or worked with these impacts more, but unfortunately not with mine.
There was actually a question from the audience, and I'll come back to this in regards to your project, Jacob. How regularly would the towers need to be serviced or replaced given the material composition and influence from Japanese structures?
Oh,
which
yeah,
are regularly replaced. Yes.
So the whole point of actually working with redwood that's locally sourced within the forest, dead trees. So old growth forests, they'll typically have 1 in 10 trees stand dead. And since the project is made entirely out of redwood, there's ample building material around that could be just like pulled out of the forest and then recomposed and brought right back in without moving any carbon out of the place. What's the rest of your question? Sorry. And then, yeah, so given their material composition, redwood is actually, when compared to other types of lumber, it's incredibly resilient. Sort of the chemical properties make it resistant to rot. It's largely attributed to its longevity and everything. But the idea was to space these along circulation paths, a service road in case of the fog towers, and then along hiking and ATV trails that could be accessed within the forest for the bio towers. Hope that answers your question.
I hope so too. Circling back to the previous question, Anna and Isa, did you have any additional thoughts in regards to your proposal, considering where we find ourselves now?
I think nothing significant would change, but we would probably add a sanitation at the entrance for people going into the shelter or even in the family center where there's a lot of people coming in and out. So like this new social distance idea would maybe have to be incorporated too.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, maybe having the family center be much more of an open space, outdoors. Outdoors family center where people can safely interact from a distance. But other than that, not any significant changes to our thesis.
It definitely had a lot of changes in the ways we conducted the studio and the sessions, especially towards the end.
So what do you all take with you? How do you move forward, and how do you use the information that you've gathered over this entire year as something that now becomes productive for your professional work? All of you, have come to fascinating results and have also done an amazing amount of research into your respective topic areas. And I know you will continue to work with these themes and areas that you've identified. So how do you take this forward? What are the next steps?
Well, I think for me, speaking for myself, when I first came into doing architecture at Tulane, I thought of it as like I'm doing a job, I'm serving a client, and I'm going to do like the best that I can for that client. But being surrounded by people who are really interested in very specific, like niche elements of architecture has made me much more like passionate about pursuing a specific like trajectory. And for me, I think I really am interested in looking at public spaces and creating like public amenities for people. Because I think those type of projects can impact people, like a lot of people, and because it's free, then people can like enjoy them. So that's one of the things I'll be taking away.
Okay.
I think also understanding that architecture doesn't operate in a vacuum, and that there's tons of like different people and input that you can use to actually create a better and stronger project, especially in terms of Kate and I's project, where we took so many outside influences to really create our end result. And whether that was, reaching out to professors or doing models and working at a variety of scales, we were jumping all the way from the macro to the micro, and just understanding that, sometimes you do have to take 2 steps back to go 3 steps forward, but really taking those skills and understanding that the design process is something that you can really believe in and that it creates strong results.
For us, we're planning to share our project with individuals in Panama that are involved in the women's organizations, shelter organizations in Panama. And also we are in the process of translating our project to Spanish so we can make it more reachable, have more reach. Yeah,
that's great. Get it built.
Yeah,
we want to go and see it, or a version of
it. Exactly.
We want to go and visit it in a few years. It will be great to go and see it. Invite us when it's all done.
Definitely.
That's great. I think we're running out of time here for our session. Again, thank you all for coming back, playing students now that you're young professionals. And good luck moving forward. And hopefully we'll see you, or we'll walk into one of your projects, whether it's a public space or a shelter, or go on a hike in the forest and
I recommend everyone should.
Towers. That would be fantastic.
Or going underground in Jerusalem.
Or underground. Thank you again for joining us. It was a pleasure seeing you. Thank you, Cordula, again for
thank you, Ammar.
Work. And I think we will end it here.
Yes, thank you to all of you, and good luck with everything. Please keep us posted on all the exciting developments that surely will come to you.